My name is George Williams. I'm the director of the Moore office. If you've met any of us, you know we're a small shop, so I'm director on paper, but I'm really proud of my team, who we are, and the work that we're doing. We're really excited to have you all here. We know there's a lot of interest to have Dr. Landsmark here as part of this speaker series, so thank you so much for showing up for him and for this conversation that we're about to have. So a really informal kind of introduction of Dr. Landsmark. I think a lot of folks are familiar with his biography, the work that he's done throughout his life. Just a little personal anecdote. So 10 years ago when I was an intern with Ayanna Presley's office, her first year in office, I set as my desktop background the Spoiler of Old Glory. And while a lot of folks found that really intense, while a lot of folks found that really intense, and I was an intense high schooler at the time, for me it was a reminder, right, of things that have happened in this city, things that have happened even close to the center of the power of this city, which is this building, and it was just a reminder of things that we need to continue working on. I've marveled at this man from afar. I was really excited to meet him this past fall when our office hosted a convening of 100 resilient cities to talk about racial equity in the fall. When I first met Dr. Landsmark, and I totally fanned out. Because what is so impressive to me about this wonderful man is not just how he survived that moment of trauma, right, of being attacked during a riot about busing, but all that he's given to the city since then. Right, that he healed from that in his own way, from his own self, and then found ways to give back and serve this city up until still this day. So Dr. Landsmark, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service to the city. I'm looking forward to hearing you.
Thanks. It's the last week of August. So frankly, I'm thrilled that you're all here. I want to start with a couple of quick comments. I'm not going to lecture. This is, from my perspective, a working session that's going to be useful, I think, for me as well as hopefully for you. Who's here? I mean, I don't expect everyone to introduce themselves, but while I know some of you from prior parts of my life, I don't recognize a lot of you. So if just a few of you could sort of identify yourselves so I have a sense of who's in the room. Pardon? I've heard of the BPDA. What do you do there? Okay. Yeah? Okay. Who else? People in the back are here too, I think, right? Pardon? Yeah. Oh, cool. Okay. Who else? Yeah? Yep. Oh, this is great. Anyone else? Yeah?
Disabilities Commission.
Cool. Okay, so it's not entirely clear, other than the fact that I starred in a Pulitzer Prize-winning photo, what folks know about me. What I'll say briefly is that I moved to Boston after law school and architecture school. I worked at a law firm and hated practicing law. And so I went out into the community and worked for a number of years in Roxbury with minority construction contractors. And it was in that capacity that I was coming into City Hall, actually for an affirmative action meeting, which is so ironic, about trying to get minority contractors working on projects in the South End. And at that point, it was primarily Villa Victoria. And I got attacked and I got famous, and the picture went all over the world, and suddenly I found myself in a position where I had a voice in a city that at that point in time I hadn't lived in for more than just a couple of years. And so I got a very quick introduction to the city and how it functioned. And I'm happy to talk about that then, except that now it's a different city in many respects. And given the stuff that I am doing with the city at this point, I think it's more important to talk about what we do as we move forward. In terms of things I've done with the city, some of them go back to Kevin White, where after the photo I was called in to provide a lot of advice on some things that the city might do around employment and pressuring the private sector to open up a lot of jobs, running from who the salespeople were in Filene's basement to what was going on in terms of the transportation system and why there weren't any women in high-level ranking positions at the MBTA. And then I spent a number of years running the Office of Jobs and Community Service, where I had what was really a great privilege of being able to work throughout the city on employment and training programs, and where I really had a chance to discover that the folks I was working with on adult literacy, for example, in Southie, were not fundamentally different than the people I was working with on adult literacy around unemployment in Charlestown or in Roxbury. And so I developed a number of good working relationships across the city. Great, thank you. And I went on to oversee the Healthy Boston and Safe Neighborhoods programs. And I would have to say that of all the things that I've been able to work on in the city, that is the work that has made me most proud in my life, of all the jobs I ever had. We did a number of things to address what had been a record number of murders in the city. And we were able, through a series of neighborhood-based interventions, which everyone took credit for. The police commissioner said it was all his doing, and the community groups said it was all their doing, and the 10-point coalition said it was all their doing. But the fact of the matter is that it was our doing. That is to say, all of the people who worked primarily, from my perspective, in City Hall, everyone, plus folks in the school department, folks in the police department. It was the fact that at that moment in time, we did what is happening in this room at this moment, which is to say, we came together as a group of people across departments, and we talked to each other across departments, and we discovered that rather than siloing our approaches to violence reduction and gang violence and murder, that in fact, if we leveraged our resources against each other, we were much more effective. And the consequence, which everyone raves about, both here and elsewhere in the country, is that we reduced the murder rate in the city by 80%. 80%. The numbers went from 150 down to 35. And we went through a 2-year period when there was not a single teenager who was killed in Boston because of the stuff that people in City Hall did as a group, right? And so if there's any takeaway from my comments today, it's that it's essential that we break down silos in order to talk to each other and to leverage the resources that we have in this building and at 1010 and in Dudley and at the police station and police headquarters and elsewhere. We've got to work across the traditional lines of demarcation that presumably establish what our jobs are, serving the people. And I can't say it enough. That work that I did was far and away the most satisfying work that I've ever done, in part because of the people I got to work with, and in part because every time I went into a supermarket or a barber shop or a laundromat, I knew that I had done something good for my neighbors. And they didn't always know who I was, but I knew that I had done something that was beneficial for them, and it wasn't just policy out there. It was on-the-ground stuff of dealing with mothers who were crack addicted, or getting jobs for teenagers who needed to be diverted, or finding empty housing units for folks who needed to be placed in housing units, or going out with the gang unit, which was new, or setting up the youth leadership corps, or getting the street workers out. I knew that I was doing something that was it not only felt good from a policy perspective, it was making a difference all across the city. And I could see the people who I had made a difference for. And that is profoundly satisfying. To that extent, I thank you all for the work that you're doing. The other thing I'll say about that is that when we do that kind of work, we tend to be a little bit crazy about it, right? It's mission-driven work. And it makes us all crazy, because what I learned is that those of us in this field who do this stuff tend not to take enough time for ourselves when we need to. And that's why I make the comment that seeing you all here in the last week of August is kind of stunning to me, because you need to take a break. And the city schedule never really permits for that. So I strongly encourage you to, look ahead and try to find those days when you might be able to get away and do the thing that most of the people in the private sector are doing at this moment while we're in here doing this, and that is to say, please take a break. Anyway, I did that work. I then went on to run the Boston Architectural College, which I gather there are some attendees or graduates of in this room, and staff I've worked with. That was really fun. Running a college for a decade and a half on Newbury Street, that was okay. It gave me opportunities to travel around the world and do some comparative analysis and to see what other countries and other people are doing in Istanbul and Tokyo and London and what have you. And it is very much the case that every time I'm on the glide path back into Logan, I'm thrilled that I'm here. Because we're in a very distinctive city. I remind everyone that the total population of Boston is 1/4 the population of Brooklyn. 1/4 the population of Brooklyn. The entire population within 128 is the population of Brooklyn, right? And yet we beat their teams consistently. And we have the opportunity, as I often do, to run down to Providence in 45 minutes and be in a totally different environment, or to run up to the Kittery Trading Post in Maine. They're both within an hour of here. They're totally different worlds. We're very privileged to be here. We are also in a city, to get to key issues and what I'd like to talk about today. We're also in a place that is a test bed for important ideas. Because we are as small as we are, we can experiment with some ideas that we couldn't experiment with if we were in Chicago or Atlanta or New York or a number of other cities or a number of other places I can think about. As I point out to a bunch of folks, we're kind of a strange city because in many respects, we have too much talent for a city of our size. We are turning out of our universities and our think tanks every year some really smart people many of whom want to stay in Boston. Boston is neither large enough nor affordable to accommodate all of the people who want to stay here, expressing really good ideas. And one of the downsides of that is that we have lots of tiny competing groups that are trying to figure out how to fix various aspects of the city. And more often than not, they're not collaborating in ways where solutions can really be put in place. And I use, by way of example, our arts groups in the city. We have more art and music schools per capita in this city than, as far as I can tell, any other city in the world. And so hundreds and hundreds of talented artists and musicians come out of our schools every year wanting to perform and to present here. And then they complain because there aren't enough jazz clubs for them to perform in. Well, if we were St. Louis or Cincinnati, there would be enough clubs because St. Louis and Cincinnati are not graduating hundreds of superb musicians every year, but we are. And the same can be said of experts on housing and experts on economic development, right? And that underlines, again, the privilege that we have to be in a position where we have the kinds of jobs we have, where we're actually getting to do it. Because there are a lot of other people who would love to have the opportunity to do exactly the work you're doing. And they're only 2 years behind you in my graduate programs at Northeastern now, right? Not that you should feel uncomfortable about that by any stretch. Indeed, to the contrary, now that I've completed 2 years of doing urban policy analysis and teaching at Northeastern, one takeaway that I would leave you with is that those students who are from all over the world, very talented, very data-driven, very sensitive to communities, they want to work with you. They want internships. They want the opportunity to do capstone projects with you. They don't have to cost you a dime. They do cost you time. But they can produce product for you, analytical product for you, that is useful and desirable to you, and that enables you to do your job better. And they really want to work with you. They look up to you. They look to you as mentors. How many Northeastern students are here? See? And they're really good. So one big takeaway that I offer to you is, please, when you come up against a wall and you say, I wish there was some information or data that I could get on something, remember that at Northeastern, at BU, at Harvard, at BC, there are students who want to work with you to help you out in that regard. And there are questions that still need answers, which you, as workers in this building and as a part of this organization, can fix. For example, I'm teaching a housing course at Northeastern this fall. I have yet to see the study. Maybe it exists somewhere within your shops, but I've yet to see the study that tells us where the people who are being gentrified out of their neighborhoods go. We know that anecdotally, they're in Brockton, or they're out beyond Framingham, or they're up in Lynn, or they've moved up to Lowell. And that because of that, the region now has the worst congestion in America. We're proud of a lot of things, but that would be one thing that we shouldn't be so proud of. But do we have the hard data that tells us where they're living and why they have moved to those places? I haven't seen that. And you see, that hard data would be important for us, not only in terms of fixing transportation factors, but it would also be important for us in assessing social cohesion and resilience in the communities they left and in the communities they're going to. So, for example, when I worked at Harvard, helping to build a power plant and the Mission Park housing development at the foot of Mission Hill, we knew that even though people had been displaced, mostly to the South Shore, that they were all still coming back on Sundays to go to the Mission Church. And that if we wanted to do certain kinds of organizing, as among the folks who had resources, that if we worked with the Mission Church, we would be able to, in fact, hold a community together which had become dispersed. Well, at this moment, it would be useful for all of us to have some information on where people who are displaced end up going and why they're there, why that community rather than another. And getting to that kind of data is the kind of thing that our students at Northeastern can help find, because they have wonderful ways of digging below the levels of traditional data sets to get to core pieces of information. The folks at Northeastern, and this happens elsewhere, but I'm very proud of the Northeastern folks. The folks at Northeastern are the ones who have reassessed the school assignment algorithms that MIT developed to have released a report that indicates that racial segregation in our schools is actually being exacerbated by that algorithm. Our folks are the folks who work with the police department on assessing the impacts of the use of body cameras by our police officers and finding out, among other things, something that a lot of us hadn't thought about, which is there are some real privacy implications involved in police officers wearing body cameras. When an officer, for example, is dealing with a domestic dispute at the back of a laundromat and they're called in and they walk into the laundromat, not only are they getting to what goes on at the back of the laundromat, but they're also getting on camera all these families that are just there doing their laundry. And so the question is, who controls that? And what do we do about those kind of privacy implications, right? We're the people who do the annual housing report card for the city, which shows, among other things, again, that for residential patterns, we are the most racially segregated city in America. How is that possible in the context of a city where we have a mayor who says, I want racial dialogue to go on? All of our institutions are discussing race and racial equity. We have so many universities that are committed to having dialogue and discussing these issues. Yeah, we know about redlining, of course. That went on for a long time. But it may also be that we really need to think deeply about what the director of planning said in a forum just a couple of weeks ago, which is that for most Americans, our wealth, our capital accumulation, is really tied up in one asset, and that's the real estate that we own, the home that we may own. Historically, you know, unless you develop the algorithm that led you to develop some piece of software that permits you to get to a VC and come up with a product that's finally bought by Google or Amazon so you get to retire at the age of 27, which tends not to be most of us, the only way to acquire wealth in this country is to own a home. Problem is that even the most accessible home in the greater Boston area starts out somewhere around $350,000 or $400,000. And to acquire that home, you will probably have to put down 10%. And my guess is that most of the folks in this room are not sitting on a bank account with an unutilized $40,000 waiting to go into your down payment. And that's the case almost everywhere in America. So what that means is that the pathway to accumulating capital assets, the pathway to getting a home and building up personal wealth that can then be transferred to your children and to your grandchildren as you draw upon that, the value of that capital to pay for a college education or to accumulate more, a second home somewhere, that's gone. That element of the American dream is gone. And yet it is rare that anyone is talking about that at this moment. And to get to the core of what it is that it was purported that I would be talking about today, that single fact has huge racial and equity implications in this country, and particularly in Boston. If people of color, whether they've been here for a long time or are newly arrived immigrants, cannot accumulate $40,000 to put down as a down payment on a home, then they may be destined to never accumulate enough wealth to enable their children to go to private colleges in this region. And those private colleges will continue to be filled, as is the case at Northeastern, for example, with international students who can pay the bills. And that's part of the reason that Northeastern right now has the third highest number of international students of any school in America, 14,000 plus international students. More than Harvard, more than BC, more than any schools other than Liberty University in North Carolina and Southern New Hampshire University, which is an online school. Okay? So there are major implications for how we go about raising up from within our own communities those talented, hardworking people of color who now constitute the majority of people living in our city and in most of the cities around us. How will we enable them to be the leaders of the future is a very real question with deep racial implications for this region, because we're already leading the country in racial isolation in our schools, in our employment sector, and in our housing. What else is there? So I want to go back to the joy of working in this building. Every one of you in here, at some level or another, is a policymaker. Doesn't matter what job you have. You're making decisions every day that affect policy. Every day, everyone in this room. So the question is, in your day-to-day work, in your operations, what can you do that would affect policies that would make the city more open and accessible to the people who live here now? And that's where we can engage in some real dialogue. I think about that, and actually, I can tell you that the five of us on the BPDA board think about this. but we don't get to talk about it because of the open meeting law. If 3 of us get together to have a conversation about this, then it has to be an open meeting. So we're all deeply troubled, but we can't even talk about it at a policy level. But we talk about the fact that in the 5 years that I've been on the BPDA board, I've been part of approving probably something on the order of 27 or 28 billion dollars worth of projects. The numbers are mind-boggling. I mean, most of us don't even really know what $1 billion looks like. You know, $1 bills that would fill up this room and, you know, the council chamber. Who knows what $1 billion really looks like? And we've approved, as I say, maybe 27, maybe 28, maybe $30 billion worth of approval. We have also inadvertently exacerbated gentrification in the city. And don't let anyone tell you that we don't think about that. We thought about it, for example, in terms of our inclusionary policies. Do we insist that developers set aside units in their own developments or somewhere else within the broader neighborhood? And if it's somewhere else, we know we're going to get more units, which we need. But is that in some way then exacerbating the distinction between affordable units and market units? And statistically, if you look, the odds are that it does. But I haven't seen that study yet either. You know, we'll work to get that. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, people say, oh, you go to the waterfront, you go to the seaport, you don't see a lot of people of color there. Well, the question I ask is, do you see a lot of Bostonians there? How many of the people who are actually using our seaport are from Boston? We used to ask that about Faneuil Hall. How many Boston residents see Faneuil Hall and the seaport as a destination where they will want to take their kids on the weekend? And I think about this because last year I was asked to do a talk around parks, and I drove around all of our neighborhoods, and I looked at who's using our parks. One area where we are #1 in the country is accessibility to parks. We have more terrific parks all over the city than almost anyone, and they're all within like a 10-minute walk. And when you're up in East Boston, when you're in Charlestown, look at the families that are in those parks. When you're out in Brighton, and you're on the edge of the Charles River there, and kayaks and the little park along the river there. When you're in Roxbury, when you're in Hyde Park, look at who's in the parks. I mean, it's just, it's inspiring. It's us. With little kids having wonderful times. I've gotten some of the most fun and interesting and poignant photographs. I got a photograph of a guy at a Leverett Pond near my house in JP. Somehow, he had gotten his wheelchair down to the edge of the pond and was fishing from his wheelchair. I could have cried when I saw it. It was, you know, and of course I was on the Jamaica Way, so I couldn't get a picture, so I had to drive all the way around back through Brookline, right, in the hope that he would still be there, and then figure out how I could slow down on the Jamaica Way to take a picture without causing a big smack up, right? And I got it. Our parks are wonderful examples of diversity within our city. And those are the folks we want to keep here. We want to nurture their families. We want to grow them. But the question is, how can we do that given the current economic structure that we have? Now, there are some solutions, which I want to get to talking about. I want you to talk about. there are some solutions that we need to be thinking about, many of which are already either in place or under development, right? What we're doing with savings programs, for example, what we're doing with voc ed, what we're doing to develop articulation agreements between our community colleges and our larger universities. How we go about identifying the jobs of the future. I've been, I'll say, arguing with some folks within Northeastern about our location in Roxbury. Northeastern is in Roxbury. And what that could mean, for example, for educational connections that we could develop among ourselves and the vocational school, RCC, and Wentworth, and ourselves, to begin training for the green jobs of the future. Why not? Why wouldn't we do that? We've got the engineering resources, and across the street we have a school that is serving bright kids who want the jobs that will exist. I think it's up to us at Northeastern to assume kind of a leadership role in that regard, and not to wait for someone to facilitate a meeting for us, right? But there are other things of that type that are in place that we all need to be thinking about when we think about race and equity in this city, who was here, who's here now, and who will be here in the future. And a lot of that is laid out in the city's 2030 plan, which I think was a terrific, it is a terrific living document, strategic document that lays out where we want the city to be. There was huge input from young people into that plan. It's a good plan, right? But the question is, how, in our individual roles, are we implementing what's in that plan? And how are we challenging ourselves to address the implications of what's in that plan? Right? That's the question. How do we challenge ourselves to address the implications of what's in that plan? Politically, we're in a remarkable space. And I thought we were meeting upstairs. But I'm thrilled that we're meeting in this space because it's a reminder that we have never in this city had a city council. And most American cities don't have a city council dominated by women of color. What is up with that? And how do we leverage that? They represent a city that is not the city I worked with when Dapper O'Neill was on the Boston City Council, or when the City Council supported a set of overtly racist policies, funding, for example, activities that led to busing in the city. City Council spent city money on lawyers to defend racist policies. That's not happening and hasn't happened in a long time. But we do need to think about how we talk about race and equity now, today. And obviously it's a lot more subtle and refined in terms of its conversation than it used to be. I'm reminded of that by my Northeastern students all the time. What does it mean to be a person of color today, as opposed to what it meant a decade ago? Who's included in that number? And how and why? And if you are in that number, how do we make sure that all of the people of color are talking to each other and among ourselves in a way that addresses key issues of economic equity? And do we have to wait, and I say this in part because I'm trustee emeritus at the Museum of Fine Arts, do we have to wait for a 14-year-old to be offended by a suburban woman who was in the galleries and didn't like the way that young woman was moving in a gender-bending exhibition. Do we have to wait for that moment to understand that none of our cultural organizations in this town, none of the cultural organizations in this town have a person of color in a leadership role? How do we get away with that? It's not that the institutions don't do programming that relates to that. The ICA is great, the MFA is great, the stuff that comes out of Berkeley is great. But how is it that when we look across our cultural sector, our university sector, our corporate sector, not only do we see almost no people of color in leadership roles, but interestingly, we see almost no Bostonians in leadership roles. You know, this place is the incubator that draws leadership from all over the world to run our institutions. And yet, if you look at the top ranks of leadership in any of those organizations, you won't find Bostonians without regard to race. How do we address that issue? Okay? And I would submit that we address that issue by saying that we as people who live and work in Boston, who care about the next generation of valedictorians, as the Globe pointed out, really smart young people who want to make a mark on the world and the city, that we care about Bostonians in a way where we expect to see investment in them, in the way everyone in this room invests your time in the people of Boston. Everything you do. I mean, you're here to improve transportation and environmental air quality and ferry service and all of that stuff for everyone in the region, but you are here representing the people of Boston who live here and work here and are using the Orange Line. And we need, it seems to be even more vocal than we've been about the values that they bring to this region. This region wouldn't be what it is without us. And you know who knows that, among others? Every homeless person in Boston who didn't start here but came here because our homeless services are so good. I remember we used to say in the Flynn administration that the people out in Worcester would buy a one-way bus ticket for homeless people there and send them to Boston and say, get off the bus, they'll take care of you there. And that happens with a lot of other services that you provide. We're serving a region, and we're doing it, I think, extremely well. Are there glitches and flaws? Of course. I mean, that's in the nature of running a city. But the fact of the matter is, we are a hub of outstanding service and of sharing. But we're sharing coming out of a basis of our people who are diverse and committed to the city and doing wonderful things with us. So I want to open up for dialogue. I mean, I've said, I think, what I need to say around trying to be a little bit provocative about what we can do. But the point is to begin to have, as among ourselves, the conversation about how we raise the level of what racial and economic equity means in a way where we are not number one in some of the negative factors, but are in fact number one in many of the softer factors that need to go into dialogue around how we overcome the inequities. And I'll say one last thing. a year from now, the NAACP will be having its annual convention here. Now, I hadn't thought about that when I started to raise some issues a year ago about how Boston might speak to or commemorate the fact that next year everyone in the region is going to be raving about the Pilgrims' 400th anniversary. But Africans got here before the Pilgrims did, a year before, and that's this year. And the New York Times, a week or two ago, did a special section on that, and there was a lot of pushback. Oh, we don't want to hear about that stuff. Well, I'm willing to bet that people aren't going to push back so much about the Pilgrims, okay? But what all of that does is to raise a level of dialogue about who was here, because the Africans got here, but there were a lot of other people who had been here for thousands of years before that, and maybe we need to recognize them too, okay? The question is, a year from now, what is the nature and quality of the dialogue we want the attendees at that NAACP convention to have? What do we want them to say about the people of Boston that overcomes the reputation of Ted Landsmark in a photo? I got my Pulitzer for that. And Martin Scorsese used that incident in Departed, so I also got my Oscar for that. But what do we want people to say next year about who we are, right? Both statistically, but more importantly, qualitatively. What do we want the dialogue to be? And we are the ones who will shape that. So I'll stop at that point, and then I'm sorry I didn't do what I usually do if I have a talk, which is to start by saying, is there anything in particular that you would want me to talk about? So I'll ask that now, but more importantly, what I'll say is, are there thoughts that any of you have about how we move forward in this coming year to deal with some of the issues of racial disparities and equity in the city? So I'll shut up.
So we have time for one or two. If we're efficient with our time, my chief is saying that we could have 3 questions.
3 questions.
And then I just want to quickly say that the cameras
Or comments.
are recording, but it's just for City Hall employees, so this is not going on the news. Please feel comfortable that we are still within a protected work environment, right? We're looking forward to being able to have folks who are off-site from City Hall to be able to live stream this in the future. So we're just working with Do It. They're doing a great job of supporting us to figure out how we get more people in the conversation, even if they're not in the room. Thank you, Dr.
And I can't make this assurance, but I will say from the BPDA board perspective, this will not go in your personnel files. Comments, questions, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
So I have questions, especially about the NAACP conference coming in next year, and see the relationship between this building and the Black community in Boston. Like how, do you have any suggestions on how we're supposed to bridge that distrust that they have that is very valid based on a lot of the experiences that students historically had working with the city in Boston and having like mayors and city councils that were necessarily reflective of what Black Boston deserved or wanted.
Great question. I start with the short admonition that we have to remember that many of the negative things that have happened in Boston were not initiated or perpetuated by either Bostonians or people who work in city government, okay? The woman who said a stupid thing to the 14-year-old girl at the MFA was not a Bostonian, but Boston wears it. The drunk guys up in the bleachers who make racist comments towards baseball players from other teams, there's very little and no evidence that those people were from Boston. or that they worked in City Hall. So we need to remember that while this building and the work we do represents public service and civil service and what have you, there's a lot of stuff that does go on that's beyond our control. And we need to remember that when people come here, for better or worse, we are branded as representing the entire region, even though we don't necessarily represent the entire region. But because we're branded that way, we have the opportunity to use that brand in a positive way, right? And a lot of the negative stuff that has gone on is stuff that in a variety of little ways we have to keep chipping away at, right? There's not going to be one cataclysmic event. There's not one soiling of old glory photograph that will take place that will eliminate that perception. But it's all the day-to-day stuff we do. And it is also, from my perspective, the way we celebrate who's here and what their contributions to the city are that helps to underline that we are inclusive, welcoming, that we support our newly arrived populations, that we share in a variety of ways. I look at the difference, for example, between what I see in all the neighborhood newspapers, but particularly in JP where I live, that just shows the joy of people living together and celebrating together and having a great time together, and you know, the mayor's doing ribbon cuttings and you know, all kinds of stuff. You look at any one of our neighborhood newspapers, and there's this sense of real elation and joy everywhere in the city, especially this past summer. It's been great, right? But people outside the city don't necessarily see that. They don't feel that. And part of what we can do as public servants is to help to get that story out there to a much greater extent, right? It's not like we need to create anything new. We just need to talk about the positives of what's already happening. And so I would answer in that way. One other? Sir. Well, there's actually, you know, a book that was written, a couple of good books that have been written on that subject. I'll just say, growing up in New York, in a family of activist women, I had been to the March on Washington. I had been to anti-war demonstrations. When I was in college, I went to Selma and marched, you know, well, I didn't really march. I was making sandwiches in the background so the marchers wouldn't starve. So I'll never, you know, project that role to anything that it wasn't, except that I will tell you I was scared to death one night when I was out alone and night riders were cruising around looking for me to beat up. So when City Hall happened, when the photo took place, I was ready for that to the extent that I knew right away that something had happened. Obviously, I didn't see the photo until later. And, you know, they took me over to MGH, patched up my nose, and the doc said, there are press people waiting for you outside the room. Do you want to talk to them? And I specifically asked the doc to give me as heavy a bandage as possible, because it was only a little crack in my nose, you know, but I figured, here's my moment. And you know, I did I guess a fairly coherent press conference that didn't put the weight on the kids, because that would have been a waste of time. It put the weight on a system that had encouraged those kids to be out there looking for a random African American to beat up. And subsequent to that, what I realized was that it was obviously for me a personally transformative moment, and that everything I had believed, my value set up to that, had an opportunity to be realized in activities that I might do subsequent to that. All of us have what we think is a purpose in life, a mission. Sometimes it takes us a while to get to figuring out what it is, but we all feel like there's a reason we're here. And I knew fairly early on that, as a kid who'd grown up with polio in the projects, single parent, who had been given opportunities to be successful in traditional ways, that my life had to be about sharing with others and helping others to build up what was the best in themselves. And that moment was a transformative moment that enabled me to say, okay, here we go. And so the stuff I've done since then has been about that. And sometimes it meant working in this building or over at Hawkins Street on informal ways, where I could get paid to do this. And then sometimes when it was work that I did with Mayor Menino on schools and inclusion and neighborhood schools and all that sort of stuff. I had a different job, but I was a volunteer, and there's a chance to do that. And I tell everyone, we always have opportunities, whether we're working in this building or not. And that means even if we are working in this building, when we go home, right, and doing stuff at night and on the weekends, we always have opportunities to serve. Because as I said earlier, the thing is that we are serving ourselves. That's what's so amazing about the work you do. It's us that you're serving. What could be better than that, right? You're not some you're not working for some big pharma company down in the seaport, pushing drugs out into communities around the world and then getting sued because you've created an addiction problem, right? We're working for us, our own neighbors. That's pretty cool. So I was ready, and I continue to do this, and I will the rest of my life, as I expect most of you will, too. Yeah? Hi, Mom.
Yeah. She actually, so she was born in Boston, and I was born in Boston. She actually shared a picture with me when I was much younger, and it really stuck out to me and really just super impactful on me. And I'm just really happy that Mom was able to be here.
Well, thank you for coming.
Be able to hear from you and learn about your experience.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Look, for a long time, I didn't want to talk about the picture, right? Because as you note, right, I had done stuff up to that, and I've done stuff since that, right? And it's hard to have your whole life defined by one 8-second moment. But this is the last thing I'll say about this. Growing up in New York, I had the opportunity to meet Whitney Young, who was then the president of the National Urban League. And Whitney was a very smart guy. And Whitney taught me that in all of our lives, there comes a moment when you will have the opportunity to say or do the right thing. It might be at the Thanksgiving dinner when someone says something stupid. It might be when you're at the Boston Garden and someone makes an insulting comment about a handicapped person. You never know when that right moment will come. And you rarely have the opportunity to do one of two things, right? Like if you're an athlete, you've prepared for it for years, and then you get drafted, and then you know to say, I'm going to Disney World, and I'm buying my mom a house, okay? But you've had time to prepare for that, okay? And it is extremely rare that the guy who won the Spot News Photo Pulitzer Award from the previous year is going to be 30 feet from you when that moment happens, so you'll get a picture taken that dramatizes that right thing that you try to do. But in every one of our lives, there is a moment when we get to say the right thing that is either transformative for ourselves or for others. And that happens particularly in matters of racial and gender equity, where you have to say the right thing. You have to be aware of yourself, right? And since we can't prepare for that moment, we have to be ready for it all the time. Because when it comes, you don't want to look back on that Thanksgiving meal with the stupid comment that gets made, and then get in the car and go home and say to yourself, I wish I had said. You have to be ready with values and a sense of what the right thing is all the time. And I'll end with that.
Thank everybody. George, who is the director of the office, is filling in. He's doing a great job. I'm just a little tired today, but thank you all for coming. I am joined by our Chief Operation Officer for the City of Boston, Pat Wolfie. And we have a very brief presentation for Dr. Landsmark on behalf of the mayor. I was told that I shouldn't read this, but then Pat told me I had to read it.
It's too long.
It's too long. That's what I said. Okay.
Read the executive summary.
Yes. So I will try to the last two.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being so willing to do this. Okay. So it is a proclamation from the City of Boston. Many of you all are familiar with them. There are a lot of whereases. Okay. So we're good. All right. So we'll start with the last two. Whereas its research and practice interests include diversity in design, environmental design, design education, higher education administration, community-based economic development, historic preservation, and African-American art and artistry. And whereas, as Mayor Martin J. Walsh first appointed to the Boston Planning and Development Agency's Board of Directors, he has brought to the board a wealth of expertise in architecture, urban design, civic leadership, architectural and construction law, and community advocacy. Now, therefore, I, Martin J. Walsh, Mayor of the City of Boston, do hereby declare August 27, 2019 to be Dr. Ted Landsmark Day in the City of Boston.
Expecting this. Thank you all. And the other thing I'll just say, even if this hadn't happened, we have a terrific mayor in place right now. And you should all be very proud to be working as a part of this administration.
Thank you. I am certain that everyone signed in at the back. This is how we're going to continue to communicate with you as we move forward with the speaker series. I always shout out my team. There's a lovely young lady who is also serving pizza today. Her name is Jessica Philippe. Jessica, raise your hand. We also met a tall gentleman who directs the shop, George Williams in the back. George, turn around. So thank you all so much for coming. I think I've covered everything, right? Okay, any questions or concerns, you can email us or write down. I'm reading the note. I'm following instructions. All right. Please make sure we have your contact info to send surveys to participants. Next month's special guest will be Father Joe White from St. Joseph's Church and Parish. And any questions or comments or suggestions can be forwarded to bostonbrazilians.gov. Thank you all for coming. See you next month.